My name is Haddad. I would like to present to you my collaborative work with Professor Laleh Najafizadeh titled Dynamic Decoding of Intention via EEG. The outline of this presentation will be as follows. First, the objectives. Second, we present some of the interesting features of dynamic functional networks that we will employ in the two frameworks we propose here for the dynamic decoding of human intention. The first framework we propose extracts these features in the sensor space, whereas the second framework extracts them in the source space. And finally, conclusions. Objectives. We use electroencephalography, or EEG, to decode the intention of movement in humans. Towards that, we construct systems that can start the decoding process as early as possible, then dynamically update their outcomes over time. We employ the spectral, temporal, and spatial features of the identified dynamic functional networks to capture the intention of movement. Dynamic functional networks. A functional network is a temporary hypothetical assembly of a set of brain regions that show high similarities in their activity patterns during the corresponding interval. These similarities suggest a temporary collaboration among the involved brain regions on performing a common function. Therefore, since the underlying collaboration is temporary, functional networks are dynamic. What interests us in dynamic functional networks is that they can be mapped in terms of their location, as the illustrative figure here shows on the brain, their dynamics, as this figure shows here, where functional networks keep changing over time, and their rhythm, that is, the different patterns of dynamic functional networks that can be identified within the different rhythms of the EEG signals. Having examined the different features of dynamic functional networks, let's now see how they can be employed in the proposed frameworks. We start with Framework 1, Dynamic Decoding in the Sensor Space. Framework 1 is structurally simpler than the other one and computationally less complex. It localizes functional networks in the sensor space, that is the space where the EEG sensors are attached, or in other words, the scalp, and the dynamic features that it uses consist of the time sequence of functional network graphs. The first step in the first framework we propose here, as can be seen on the chart below, is temporal segmentation. Here, the dynamics are defined by breaking the EEG data into intervals during which functional networks sustain their location in the brain. To the right, we can see that the EEG signal is being broken apart into three parts or segments based on what is happening in the brain. Now, our source-informed segmentation algorithm, which we proposed earlier, uses singular value decomposition, or SVD, to estimate and monitor the space spanning the active functional networks in the brain. The algorithm returns a time sequence of EEG segments with varying intervals. The second step is functional connectivity analysis. Here, during each identified segment, a functional network is localized in the sensor space, again on the scalp, using SVD, as the equation shows. The symmetric graph of the functional network per segment is estimated using the most significant left singular space. That is a subspace of rank R of the space that spans the matrix P, as can be seen in the equation for calculating the graph. This step returns a time sequence of functional network graph vectors consisting of only the upper triangles of these graphs because they are symmetric. Having extracted the features of the dynamic functional networks, the next step is feature selection, which is to select the graph patterns most discriminatory between the considered tasks. And here we employ the common spatial patterns, or the CSP analysis. The extracted time sequence of functional network graph vectors, these are the features we extracted so far, are then projected onto the task discriminating patterns to obtain a time sequence of selected feature vectors. The last step in Framework 1 is the dynamic classifier. Here, to take advantage of the dynamic nature of the extracted features, a recurrent neural network, or an RNN classifier, with one-step delay is employed. A classification decision is made at the end of each EEG segment, starting with the very first segment identified in the EEG data. The decision is updated dynamically at the end of each following segment during the trial. This same dynamic classifier and the same classification concept will be used also in Framework 2, which will be discussed later in this presentation. Now let's examine the experimental data that we collected for the training and testing of both Framework 1 and 2 that we proposed here. The experiment consisted in a visually cued motor execution versus imagery tasks. We had 4 tasks. 2 of them involved the squeezing of one of the 2 hands, and 2 of them involved the movement of the tongue. As can be seen in the illustrative figure, which task was chosen by the direction of the cue, and the movement intention was decoded during the 3-second interval shown here on the illustrative figure that covers both the task planning and the task performance intervals. Now for the experimental results of Framework 1. Here, figure 10 shows the dynamic decoding or classification accuracy of Framework 1 for all 4 motor execution versus imagery tasks that we mentioned earlier. As you can see, the accuracy is dynamic. That is, it changes over time. And the decoding accuracy reaches a reasonable level only 500 milliseconds after presenting the task planning cue. The average accuracy at 500 milliseconds is 69%. Now let's examine Framework 2 for dynamic decoding in the source space. Framework 2 employs a deeper hierarchical structure and is computationally more extensive. It localizes functional networks in the source space, that is, in the cortex or in the brain. The dynamic features it employs consist of the time sequence of multi-scale functional subnetwork maps. The first step of Framework 2 is multi-scale analysis. Here, EEG is decomposed using wavelet transform into 6 dyadic subbands, with the bands given below. These subbands are normalized for equalization, then augmented or stacked into 6 band-specific sensor sets. And it is this augmented signal that is passed to the second step of Framework 2, which consists in the source-informed segmentation algorithm we discussed earlier. The third step of Framework 2 is functional connectivity analysis. However, here the augmented EEG is passed to the source localization algorithm that is called Asilomar in order to estimate the augmented cortical activity. And now, during each identified segment, functional networks are localized in the source space, hence decoding in the source space, but again using the same SVD method. And instead of graphs, now the maps of the localized functional subnetworks are calculated through thresholding the most significant left singular vectors, as the equation shows. Having extracted the multi-scale dynamic functional networks and their features in the past 3 steps of Framework 2, now we move to feature selection. However, now that we have thresholded these features, data type of these feature vectors is now Boolean. Therefore, we formulate the problem of estimating the Boolean functional subnetwork maps occurring more likely in one task than the other as the discriminative Boolean matrix factorization given by this equation. To solve this problem, we employ our previously proposed discriminative associative, that is the Dassault algorithm, which assesses cross-matrix differences in pairwise correlations among the occurrence patterns. Now, the extracted time sequence of functional subnetworks is to be projected onto the task discriminating maps that the Dassault algorithm gave us in order to obtain a time sequence of selected feature vectors. Now for the experimental results of Framework 2. Figure 16 shows the dynamic decoding or the classification accuracy of Framework 2 for all 4 execution versus imagery tasks. As we can see, for Framework 2, the decoding accuracy reaches a good level after only 200 milliseconds of presenting the task planning queue. This averages to 78.4% after only 200 milliseconds of the task planning queue. After 500 milliseconds, Framework 2 reaches an accuracy level of 81.1%. In conclusion, here we proposed 2 functional network-based dynamic intention decoding frameworks. The 2 frameworks share 2 of the main steps. These are the temporal analysis carried out using the source-informed segmentation algorithm and the dynamic classification step, which is carried out using an RNN. In addition to that, they both rely on features extracted from functional networks. Here, figure 17 compares the dynamic intention decoding accuracy of the 2 proposed frameworks, and we can see that Framework 2, while more complex, is more accurate at all times. Thank you for watching.